Have your Bibles open to Matthew chapter 23, verse 13. We're going to begin there and finish this chapter. Last week we finished Matthew 22 and actually got into Matthew 23 just a little bit, Matthew 23, 1 through 12. And in last Wednesday's video, we read Matthew 23, verse 1, then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples. Now, when he's speaking to the multitudes and to his disciples, he's speaking to them about the scribes and the Pharisees. But then we come to Matthew 23:13, and he's not speaking to the multitudes and the disciples anymore. Now he's speaking directly to the scribes and the Pharisees. And these are scathing rebukes. I mean, you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of the teachings of Jesus here, what he said to the scribes and the Pharisees, scathing rebukes. And here are three things that he said to them. One thing he said is that their religion, instead of being a blessing unto others, was actually a curse unto others. Look at verse 13, and then we're going to see that he said the same thing to them in verse 15, that their religion was actually a curse unto those that they tried to convert. Matthew 23:13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering in to go in. So there were those that they would try to teach, to bring into the kingdom, and they weren't even going into the kingdom. The kingdom was shut off from them, and then it would be impossible for those that they taught to enter into the kingdom. And that would be because of their traditions. It would be because of their legalistic approach to things, and their hypocrisy made it impossible for them to be effective teachers. So people were not going to enter the kingdom of heaven if they would listen to the scribes and the Pharisees, because their religion, their teaching, actually made them worse off. And the same idea is in verse 15. We'll skip verse 14, come back to it. But in verse 15 he said, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel about on sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. And so they would go to great effort to proselyte people, to make these Gentiles converts to Judaism. But once they converted somebody, it just made them a child of hell. It made them worse off than ever. Their efforts to convert others left them worse instead of better, and they were just destined for hell. So three things he said about them as he's speaking directly to the scribes and Pharisees. One, their religion was not a blessing. Their religion was actually a curse to others. A second thing that he said about them is that they were cruel to the weak and to the vulnerable. Isn't that a terrible thing to say to somebody? That they were cruel to the people who were vulnerable and weak. And that's what he said in verse 14. He said, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, even while for a pretense you make long prayers, therefore you shall receive greater condemnation. Now, in Exodus chapter 22, this is one of the many passages in the Old Testament where we see God's feelings toward the fatherless, the widows, those that were weak and vulnerable. He wanted them to be protected and not exploited. But we read here in Exodus 22, verses 22 and 23. Exodus 22, 22 and 23. The law of Moses said, you shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry. But here the Pharisees, instead of protecting the fatherless and the widows, exploited them. They robbed them, devoured widows' houses, and then they tried to cover it up. And they tried to cover it up by making these long prayers. Again, we go back to our text, Matthew 23:14. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, even while for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you shall receive greater condemnation. And so they were trying to come across as being exceedingly religious and holy before the people by making these long prayers, and it was a cover-up for what they were actually doing. They were cruel to the weak and to the vulnerable. And then a third thing that he said about them is that they were just outright dishonest. They were dishonest. Matthew 23, verses 16 through 22. Matthew 23:16. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore he who swears, swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple, swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And he who swears by heaven, swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Well, they thought that they had found a loophole by which they could deceive others when they took their oaths. They thought that their oaths were binding or not binding, depending upon the object by which or on which they swore. And so, if whoever swears by the temple, this is verse 16, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. That is, you're not obligated then to make good on your promise. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. Well, then he's obligated to do what he said he would do, to fulfill that oath. Again, in verse 18, whoever swears by the altar, well, that is nothing. That's nothing. You're not obligated then. But whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. Now, could you ever trust anybody like that? You take somebody today who says, well, now I'm telling you the truth this time. Well, that kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Well, what about all those other times that he said something? Was he trying to deceive us then? And that was such was the character of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, I do not believe that Jesus teaches that we cannot take an oath in a court of law. And can we do what Jesus did? And can we do what the Apostle Paul did? Now, here's what Jesus did. As we go to the book of Matthew chapter 26, verses 63 and 64. Matthew 23, Matthew 26, beginning with verse 63. Now here we read in verse 62 that the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? And then in verse 63, but Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, I have a footnote in my Bible on the words adjure you. And it says, or charge you under oath. He said, I charge you under oath. I adjure you by the living God. Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus answered under oath. He said in verse 64, you have said it yourself. In other words, it is as you say. I am Jesus, the Son of God. In the book of Romans, chapter 1 and verse 9, Paul had no problem calling upon God as his witness. In Romans 1, verse 9, he's testifying that what he said was the truth. Romans 1, verse 9, Paul said, for God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you. And then one other reference, and that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. 2 Corinthians 1 and in verse 23. Here, let me get out of 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and in verse 23. Same thing. He's calling upon God as his witness. He said, but I call God as witness to my soul, that to spare you I came no more to Corinth. Now, the courts today need extra assurance and require an oath. And I see no problem at all in the Christian complying with what it is that the court desires. They need that extra assurance. They don't know us. They don't know our character or the character of those who are about to testify in court. And so for extra assurance, they require the oath. And I don't think Jesus was taking issue with that in his teaching here in Matthew chapter 23. What he was taking issue with was the character of the scribes and the Pharisees. They weren't honest. And our character should be such that when we say yes, then everybody who knows us know that we mean yes. And when we say no, they know that we mean no. They can trust us. You know, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he taught about the matter of taking oaths. And in that context, in Matthew 5, verse 37, he said, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, and anything beyond these is of evil. And so it is today. When you say yes, people need to understand that that's exactly what you mean. When you say no, then you mean no. And they can take you at your word. And you don't need to take an oath. Now, in a court of law, again, that's a requirement of the court, and that's fine. But in our everyday life, and that's something that Jesus was taking issue with, was just the everyday life of the scribes and the Pharisees, and the way that they were trying to find loopholes so that they could tell a lie to other people. You know, we might boast that we follow book, chapter, and verse. We are the true people of God. Of what value, though, is our religion if we do not have the right kind of character? Of what value is our religion if we're kind of like those scribes and Pharisees? If we're not honest in our speech and our dealing with others, if we're not merciful to the weak and to the vulnerable, if our religion is not a blessing unto others, but actually a curse to them, then just like the scribes and the Pharisees, our religion will be of no value to us or to others at all. All right, now let's continue now in Matthew chapter 23. And here Jesus continues his condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees. And here's something that he says about them as we notice their hypocrisy. That's what I want you to especially notice now about the scribes and the Pharisees. I want you to notice their hypocrisy. And Jesus sets that forth here in three ways. First of all, they were concerned about outward appearance. They were concerned about the outward observance of the small things but were not concerned about what Jesus calls the weightier things. As you look here in Matthew 23, verse 24, he said, "You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." Now, they were really concerned about swallowing an unclean gnat, and so they would strain the wine before they drank it to make sure they did not swallow an unclean gnat. But it's kind of like Jesus is saying here in a very humorous way, but in the process, you're okay with swallowing the largest unclean animal of all. You swallow a camel. Now, he said that right after verse 23. In verse 23, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." So he says, you're really careful to obey the small details of the law, to tithe even concerning the smallest of herbs, mint, dill, and cumin. But while you're observing those small things, you fail to practice justice and fairness to others. You fail to show mercy and compassion for those who are in distress. And you're not faithful in performing the will of God. Now, was Jesus saying here, hey, don't sweat the small stuff, the tithing of those small herbs. Don't sweat the small stuff. No, he didn't say that at all. In fact, he said the opposite. He said here, these are the things you should have done, practice justice, mercy, and faith, without neglecting the others. So he said, don't neglect those other things. But while you're doing those things, make sure that you observe justice, mercy, and faith. All right, and then another thing that he said, which just drives home how hypocritical they were, is that they made sure that they appeared outwardly to be so good and holy, but inwardly they were full of evil. Let's read this in verses 25 through 28. He said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." We remember the proverb chapter 4, verse 23, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." Make sure that the inside is good. Keep your heart with all diligence. Make sure that the inside is good, that it's clean and right. And then what comes out of the heart, he said, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of the heart are the issues of life. What comes out of the heart? The outward things. Then they will be good, clean, and right. So they appear just like those whitewashed or painted tombs. They appeared clean and righteous and good on the outside, but inside they were full of all kinds of wickedness and sin. And so this just again made so apparent their hypocrisy. They made sure they appeared outwardly to be clean and pure, but inwardly they were full of dead men's bones. They were full of evil. And then a third thing that made known their hypocrisy is that they claimed that they would have never killed God's prophets of old. Those prophets that were sent out by God in the Old Testament, they would have never killed them but they were about to murder God's future messengers, the apostles, and even to kill God's Son, Jesus Christ. In verses 29 through 31, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, our Jewish ancestors, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Consequently," Jesus said, "consequently you bear witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets." So here they went about erecting the tombs and memorials for the prophets of God who had been murdered by their Jewish ancestors. And the scribes and the Pharisees went around saying, boy, we wouldn't have done what they did. We would not have participated in the shedding of their blood. But even while they were saying that, they were plotting to kill Jesus Christ, the ultimate prophet, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Jesus told them in verse 31, just go ahead and finish what your father started. In verse 31, he said, you bear witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Verse 32, fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. Finish what they started. Just complete that iniquity and that guilt. He said, you are truly the sons of your Jewish fathers. You're just like your murderous and evil Jewish ancestors. In verse 33, he said, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of hell? What a scathing rebuke that is. You snakes, you offspring of vipers, you who are just like your Jewish fathers. How can you escape the sentence of hell? Well, that's pretty harsh. That's very stern. But you know, these scathing rebukes were actually an act of goodness and an act of love on the part of Jesus, because it was for their good. But not only was it for the good of the scribes and the Pharisees, it was good for those that might be influenced by them, because their teachings, their religion did make people worse instead of better. So an act of goodness was to confront them, just like Jesus did. And we need to learn from the master teacher. Jesus did this out of love. He did it out of the goodness of his heart. And then in verse 34, he said, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Now you see, God had already sent men to their Jewish fathers. He had sent Jeremiah, Isaiah, other prophets of God. Many of them they persecuted. Some of them they killed. And now Jesus said, others will be sent. I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. Now here's a prediction that was made by Jesus that is fulfilled in the book of Acts. All you have to do is go to the book of Acts and read about all of the blood that was shed there by those Jews as they persecuted Stephen and Paul and other men that were sent by Jesus. They would be treated, Jesus said, just like the prophets of old. So vengeance was coming from God. Verse 35, he said that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, according to the way the Old Testament books were arranged by the Jews, the Old Testament canon, their Jewish arrangement, Genesis was first, And then Second Chronicles was last. Now, the blood of Abel, this righteous man, he was shed in the book of Genesis, the first book. But then Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, well, now that's recorded in Second Chronicles, which, according to the way the Jewish books were arranged, well, that was last. And so such was their history from the first martyr to the last. From the first book to the last, you find that this was their Jewish history of shedding the blood of these righteous men of God. Well, they were going to have to pay for that. Punishment was coming. And so he said in verse 36, he said, "Truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation." This generation, the people, those Jews who were living at that time when Jesus was speaking, then the punishment was coming upon them. In the very next chapter, Jesus describes the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which would be a manifestation of punishment coming from God on those Jews because of their rejection of the prophets and of their rejection of God's Son, Jesus Christ. Now, in verses 37 through 39, Jesus laments over the city of Jerusalem because it is about to be destroyed because of their sins. Reading now, Matthew 23, 37 through 39. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling." You see, the Lord wanted to save them. The Lord wanted to save those Jews. But there are two wills involved. There's what God was willing to do, what Christ was willing to do, but also there was the will of those Jews. And they were not willing. So there's a contrast between what Jesus said, what he wanted. I wanted to do this. I wanted to save you. But you were unwilling. And then in verses 38 and 39, he said, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you shall not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." There he said, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." God had left the temple. God had abandoned the temple. He had abandoned the Jews because they abandoned God. God loved them. God wanted them to be saved. But they made a choice to abandon God. And God had no choice then but to withdraw his presence from the temple and from their temple worship. So, that being the case, here in chapter 24, as we will start there next week, here's a passage that premillennialists use to speak of the signs of the time. That we just know that Jesus is coming very, very soon. In our lifetime, Jesus is coming because you see the signs here. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about what we refer to as the second coming, the final coming of Jesus. But while he did speak here of an end, it's not the end of time as we know it. But here he's speaking of the end of the Jewish state, which occurred, we could say, in AD 70. Just 40 years from the time that Jesus died on this earth. The end of the Jewish state and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. That will be our study next week.